back with you on Pirate Radio Live here on a Monday, back in the swing of things and gearing up for Pirate football. Got a big announcement regarding our Pirate Radio football kickoff party coming up on Thursday. So we are counting down the days to that, to Pirate football and to the start of another football season. And we are halfway through our ECU opponent previews. And today we will talk to an old friend about a really good team from a year ago that made a magical run, the Tulane Green Wave, coming off an awesome 12-2 campaign, and Corey Gloor was on the call for that, and he'll be on the call for more Tulane football this fall, and he joins us here on Pirate Radio Live. Corey, hello.
Can you give me any sort of a teaser of what this big kickoff party announcement's going to be? Like, is there going to be cake?
Do we have cake? I don't know if we... Yes, the band Cake will be performing. We're going the distance.
Well, then I will be there.
All right. Hey, look, there's a big announcement. If Cake performs at the Pirate Radio Football Kickoff Party, Corey Gloor will be there. Corey, how are you doing down there in Nolens?
I'm doing well. It's so warm, but I'm doing well. This is just a soupy, warm time of year down here. So I'm battling through that. But other than that, I'm doing well. Refreshed off a little vacation I just got back from, and we're about 50 some odd days away here. So counting down those days.
Recapping Tulane athletics and the events that you called, Corey. I don't know if it's surprising. Maybe I overrate Tulane basketball because I like Ron Hunter so much, but the magical run in football, the improbable run you guys had at the end of the baseball year, does it almost make basketball look like a disappointment? Like, that might have been the sport I would have said, okay, Tulane has the most success in will be basketball in 2022.
You know, it's funny. I was reading a piece in the paper here in which Tulane basketball, they're in a couple of weeks, they're heading over to China to play in the World University Games as Team USA's representative. And so they were doing some media about it. And Jalen Forbes, who's now the real leader of the team here, he was talking about how much of a failure last year was. And that was a 20-win year, and that's the first time that's happened in a decade here. And so the fact that, of the three teams that I spend most of my time around, that's the one that people are calling the failure from this past season. It certainly means that some really good things happened across the board. Now, getting the way baseball got to an NCAA tournament was very unconventional, and it's not recommended, but they got there, and they got there in a pretty amazing way. And so the fact that now all three of those programs that I'm going to be calling games for here next year are coming in with some pretty high expectations, you can kind of feel the buzz around this place, even though we're overall, nearly 2 months out from this semester beginning.
Corey, when you look back at football last year, that 12-2 mark, and you see, I look at the schedule, how many one-score games, how many nail biters, because if you have a special season, you play really well in close games. You look back to TCU last year, and they had some miracle finishes. They had the fire drill, they had to run on the field and kick the field goal. I remember that one specifically, but just a ton of one-score games. How, I don't know if fluky is the word, but how many of those games were you in last year that you ended up winning that were 50-50 games that made that a special season? And how many did Tulane kind of dominate? We saw the East Carolina game. It was close. East Carolina just couldn't get anything going offensively that day. Tulane pretty much dominated, especially on the defensive side. So what was the ratio of, man, we got out of there by the skin of our teeth, and wow, we dominated on that Saturday?
I think you can look at, with the exception of the conference championship game, well, I guess actually that's really the only one that can come to mind here. Of the major games that you look back on from last season that Tulane won, they were one-score games. I think about Kansas State on the road. I think about Houston on the road. I think about winning at Cincinnati to close the regular season. Those were all one-score affairs. And so, like, the big ones that they got, and then the Cotton Bowl was a one-score game, obviously. That was a one-point win. And so those types of games, Tulane did wind up on the positive side of. They had some comfortable ones in there. They crushed SMU. You mentioned the ECU game that was close, but it was kind of the defense really kind of locked things down the second half and just kind of keeping ECU at arm's reach the entire way. They had a huge lead on Memphis, nearly gave it all back, but still won by, I think it was 11 in the final of that homecoming game. And so, that they fared very well in close games, but it was not, it wasn't, half of the wins. There were about 4 of them, I would say, in which were the one-score affairs that were nail-biters. The other 8 or so, Tulane kind of seemed to have possession of throughout the course of last year.
Corey Gloor joining us. Corey, I'm reluctant to say that Tulane can repeat what they did a year ago, but because we see these kind of magical years and they're just tough to sustain. But one thing they do have that some of these other teams in the past that had magical years don't have, that's a returning coach and a great coach in that at Willie Fritz. So let's go with other returners, Corey. How familiar would this team look this September to the one that won all those games last year?
Well, the quarterback returns, and I think that's probably going to be the biggest reason as to why Tulane's going to be picked near the top of the league this year. I don't know if they'll be a preseason favorite. We'll see in a couple of weeks. They should be, in my mind, no lower than 2 in the preseason poll. I think UTSA is probably the other school that will have a candidacy here to be the preseason conference champion, because we haven't seen them, but they return so much of that team that's been dominating the last couple of years in Conference USA. And so I think Tulane's going to be 1 or 2 in the preseason poll, and having a 4-year starting quarterback is going to be a huge impetus for that. You'll lose 2 key pieces of your defense, your defensive leaders, the linebacking core of Dorian Williams and Nick Anderson. Williams was drafted by Buffalo, and Anderson signed with the Saints afterward. And then you lose Tajay Spears, who's the conference offensive player of the year last year, and he's a member of the Titans now. And so those are big voids to fill. But around that, there's a lot of returning force here. The offensive line is pretty well intact from last year. The defensive line all returns from last year. You do have a new defensive coordinator, so we'll see how Sheil Wood tweaks how this team runs defense. That was such a strength of last year's team, and that was kind of a zone coverage defense that predicated a Cotton Bowl win. And now Sheil Wood tend to be a little bit more aggressive in his time at Troy, and so we'll see how that changes the way this defense looks. Your cornerbacks are back by and large. You will have some new safeties to work in here. Wide receivers are pretty well returning here, with the exception of 2 main guys, but they spread the ball pretty well with their wide receiving core last year. And you got some tight ends that you're going to be stepping up here, because you lost 2 fifth-year seniors in that position last year. So it's a blend, there's no question, but I think there's some key pieces that are returning in your quarterback, your offensive line, your defensive line, and your cornerbacks. And all the special teamers return if you want to throw them into the mix here as well. But I think the biggest one that you mentioned is the fact that Willie Fritz is back. And that was in peril for a couple of days right before the conference championship game. So having him back, even with some coaching turnover and one of the more successful years in terms of his players going on to the next level, like what he just saw here, there are very few around the American that I think would get a pick in terms of the coach you'd want to have, even if there's a little bit more transition than you're used to seeing.
Yeah, and man, I love seeing coaches stick at their spots, and I'm glad to see Willie Fritz back and see what he can do this year. And of course, Corey, when you're a good team, and even when you're not a great team overall, but have good players, the poachers come, and of course they came after Tulane. And I know Willie Fritz and even Ron Hunter. I read his tweet on the air a couple weeks ago. I remember about guys, coaches in the coaching world going after his players, and Ron Hunter said, "Hey, next time I see you, I'm going to say something to you. We're going to talk about it." So I think both of your coaches have been kind of outspoken about these poachers and these other schools trying to come in and get their guys, right?
Very, and we're talking a little bit more basketball than I think you're interested. But there are leaders back on that team coming up this year. That there was certainly one school, and if you just do a little bit of research, you can find out who it was that was very much going after one of them, despite the fact he was never in the portal. And listen, when you have a They have a starting quarterback for 3 years that had a very good year and a very good postseason, and you've been a middling SEC team. Then even though he wasn't in the portal, you find a way to get to him. And Willie Fritz nipped that in the bud pretty quickly back in December. So yeah, I mean, you have to now, until this somehow gets reined in, the transfer portal, the NIL situation. And you have a lot of folks out there at the upper levels of college athletics that have a lot of resources, that have a lot of avenues, and have a lot of people that kind of do their bidding that can skirt around some things. You're going to need, outspoken coaches like a Willie Fritz or a Ron Hunter to call people out for doing things incorrectly. And luckily they have, and that has quieted things down here a little bit. Even though some of the higher profile student athletes here at Tulane were being sought after pretty intensely by some other folks.
Corey Gloor joining us, play-by-play voice of the Tulane Green Wave. Looking at the non-conference schedule this year, Corey, South Alabama. Everybody will, of course, highlight the Ole Miss game September 9th. I'm going to keep an eye on the game in Hattiesburg at Southern Miss because they ruined what would have been even a more special season for Tulane last year. I think it's impressive Tulane can lose to a Southern Miss at home last year and still bounce back and have the year they had. Kind of gives teams hopes that if you lose early, you can still make it into a very special season. But the Green Wave have to have some revenge on the mind for that one on the road September 16th, and then also Nichols on the non-conference schedule as well. So, again, the headliner will be Ole Miss. You got the revenge factor with Southern Miss. You'll start with USA. What do you think about the non-conference slate?
It's challenging. I mean, South Al is a 10-game winner last year, and so you start off with them, and then you host Ole Miss, and that's going to be a 2:30 kickoff in the afternoon in New Orleans in early September. That is going to be it's going to be steamy here, and so that will provide a challenge. There's no question about that. And then, yeah, I think the folks that return from last year's team, and there are many, I think have that trip to Hattiesburg on their mind because they to a man said that loss last year at home to Southern Miss was the impetus for making the run that they did. They ripped off 5 wins in a row after that game. Like that, they came together after that loss to Southern Miss. It was their first loss of the year. That came just after beating Kansas State, and they had a players-only meeting, a team-only meeting, and then they ripped off 5 wins in a row. And so I think many folks, they might not say it, but I think it's easy to glean that they see that game, that trip to Hattiesburg, as kind of the last notch of the last feather in the cap of last season. And if you can go there and get a win, that would kind of put a bow on everything that happened last year. It'd be a fitting kind of finish to everything that happened in 2022 is to go into that place and get a win there. The team that sparked your run by winning in your building, and that's a rivalry game. There's a trophy on the line for that one. And to grab that bell back and bring it back to New Orleans, I think people would see that as kind of a final chapter of last year.
Corey, looking at the conference slate with the newcomers rolling in, you'll see a few of those. You'll also, if you look at it from a gambling standpoint, and we got Phil Steele's magazine, he kind of looks at it the same way. There's like a big four going into the year picked to potentially win the American. That includes defending champion Tulane. That includes Memphis and SMU, and also newcomer UTSA. Beyond that, you got FAU, you got East Carolina. So Tulane avoids SMU. You can look at that as a good thing, but you do have UTSA. You get them at home. You're on the road at Memphis. You do go on the road to FAU, and of course here to Greenville as well. So could be a little tougher, I guess, if SMU was on it, but you do got some tough opponents there within the conference slate.
Well, and I think what stood out to me on the conference slate, I think everyone around the league is hoping that last weekend of the year against UTSA has some sort of importance.
Yeah.
And that's why it's sitting as a Friday or Saturday game. We'll see. But what stood out to me is that there's not a ton at the bottom of the league or the projected bottom of the league on Tulane's schedule. South Florida is off the schedule now. You don't get Temple, don't get Navy, don't get Charlotte coming in with a coaching overturn. And so, like, the worst you're going to see is going to be the middle of this league. And so that means there is, last year Tulane got South Florida, Tulane got Tulsa, and so they got some of the teams at the bottom of the league to help things out. Now, they had to go to Cincinnati and win, and no one had done that 5 years, and that's what they did. And so they had to play UCF not once but twice, and they went to Houston and won there. And so they had challenges last year, but they could hinge a little bit on getting some of the teams at the bottom on their schedule. As we sit right now, that doesn't appear to be the case. And so, yeah, SMU's not on the schedule, but you have road trips to UTSA, to ECU, to FAU, as you mentioned. You have North Texas coming in, who's a bit of a question mark on your schedule. UAB is a bit of a rivalry game, but you don't have really the supposed bottom of the league really on your schedule this year. And so I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is that there's not going to be a ton of let up here for this Tulane team, and they have a pretty early off week as well. It comes in the first week of October, which means getting to the end of November is going to be a huge test physically.
Corey Gloor joining us, Pirate Radio Live Line. Corey, in your relatively young play-by-play career, you've called a lot of magical games at Clark LeClaire Stadium and elsewhere with ECU baseball. You were able to call, I don't know how you could top Tulane beating USC and the way they did in that game, but also Tulane winning the AAC tournament and playing eventual national champion LSU in a regional. So, I mean, you're pretty dang lucky, Corey. I know you're a Midwestern doom and gloom guy, but let's say you're a pretty lucky fella. What do you think?
I'm fortunate that I've been along for the ride here of some pretty amazing moments, both here at Tulane and in my time in Greenville. And yeah, the regional was a bit of a blur because it was so unexpected. I mean, you don't win 15 games in a regular season and be in an NCAA tournament. And so, frankly, I wasn't that terribly surprised about how things went in the regional for Tulane back in the first weekend of June. But that week in Clearwater was one of the most surreal, special weeks I've had in calling games, because Clip, that team got run-rolled by Memphis twice the weekend before. I mean, there's no sign that anything like that was coming. And then for them to just go through that tournament and culminating with beating ECU was just that's one of the more, again, surreal is the word I go back to it, because it was so out of the blue that they could pull that off. And so to have the year, I kind of see that as how the year capped up. I definitely don't take for granted calling regionals. I called my fair share at Greenville, and now I find, I get one here in year two at Tulane. But that Clearwater week, that was something else, and it was one hell of a way to finish out season 2 for me here.
No doubt. Corey Gloor joining us, Pirate Radio Live Line, and Corey, our next guest, Garrett Short, is wearing his Chicago Bears hat, so I'll save the Bears questions for him, unless you'd like to talk about your Bears right now.
I love the direction they're heading, and they come here to New Orleans in November.
Oh, cool!
I think I'm gonna make my attempt to go see them here. I'm actually rosy about the Chicago Bears. They're not going to win many games, but that's fine. They're doing what they should do. So yes, you can more specific Bears questions to later, but you should be shocked to know how optimistic I am about the Chicago Bears.
That is quite shocking, but happy about your young, talented QB and the direction, as you say, the Bears are heading. Corey, thanks for joining us, man. We'll talk to you again during the football season as we preview the matchup ECU and Tulane. They'll be playing November the 4th, and we'll talk to you then, and maybe before then, but have a great rest of your summer, Corey, and we'll talk again soon, man.
Flip, you're a gentleman and a scholar. You're a good man.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Corey Gloor joining us today here on Pirate Radio Live.